Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Even the school requires children under the age of 10 not to wear them. So why would I make them wear them? Why?
It's being ridiculous. Y'all still
You're so ridiculous.
All die.
You take care of yourself. Bye.
All die. You're going to kill me.
That's such a great thing to say to somebody.
But I'm wearing a mask.
Yeah, good for you. Bye.
Well, look at that. Hey, I hope you die. Does that woman really hope that those children die because they're not wearing their masks? You know, I should tell you that in all of Canada, a country of 37 million souls, only one person under age 20 has died from the virus, and they had a pre-existing terminal illness. In fact, I really don't think young people die from the coronavirus. If anyone was likely to die in that situation, it was the woman scolding them, but I don't actually think she wanted people to die. I think she's just so stressed out by the fear that has turned into the larger pandemic, a pandemic of fear. And she's been told that people without masks are the danger, and that wearing a mask is like some holy symbol, like a garlic clove to ward off a vampire or something. I think it's clear that the conditioning of ourselves to be in a perpetual state of fear is what's actually going to cost lives. Joining me now in studio to talk about this is one of our favorite guys, Aaron Rosenberg, our free speech lawyer, who's also here today to talk to us about mask bylaws across Canada. Aaron, how you doing?
Very well. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. You know, the thing that we're going to go through the mask bylaws, because about a week ago we went through maskexemption.ca with you. Mm-hmm. We talked about the Toronto bylaw and the special exemptions. And we told our people that they could buy a little laminated wallet-size mask exemption card from us that has the specific portion of the bylaw on the back. But now that there's about 10 different bylaws across the country, we have another version of the mask exemption card. We don't have one for every single city in town. We just have a generic one, and it says to see the details of the exemption, click maskexemption.ca. And then hopefully the shopkeeper or the public member will go to the website and they'll see this chart, which we're still tweaking right now. So we're here today, Aaron, to update our viewers on some of the various jurisdictions. We've had a few different lawyers work on this, yeah. So you're here to talk about the different exemptions in different towns.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's right. You know, they've got, as you know, Ezra, the provinces have decided not to get involved in regulating these matters, and
in most cases, I think Nova Scotia regulates.
Yeah. So in most cases, the provinces have said this is not really something we're comfortable legislating. We're not comfortable requiring or mandating masks. So what's been left is the vacuum has been filled by a patchwork of municipal bylaws. They seem to hew along the same lines as the other jurisdictions, but there's still a patchwork. They're somewhat inconsistent, and that raises a whole bunch of problems, which I'm sure we're going to talk about.
It is. They're inconsistent. You have different quality lawyers working for this town or this city. I do note that there are two provinces that the whole place is covered, Quebec and Nova Scotia. You also have different rules for airports and airlines. So the first question that jumps to mind is, they can't all be accurate. They can't all be medically sound. If this place has this exemption and this place doesn't, it's clear that this isn't medicine we're talking about anymore. This is politics.
This is an extremely political issue, as you described, and the cities are left with the determination as to whether they want to make a political statement that they will not make masks mandatory, or the political statement that they will. And I think what we've seen with the cropping up of all of these bylaws across the country is that municipalities would err more towards the side of mandating masks and being part of the milieu that feel that masks are absolutely necessary, must be mandated.
I think one of the problems is who enforces it. We saw that scolding woman telling the kids that she hoped they died. What I hate about these bylaws is they turn ordinary Canadians into informants, snitches, cops, and judges. People who didn't want to do that, who just want to positive relationship with their clients and customers now are enforcers, and it's pitting people against each other. And let me just show you this. You've probably seen this video before. This is from Quebec. We've tried to reach out to this individual. He was in a Tim Hortons, didn't want to wear his mask. Did he have a medical exemption? Did he have some asthma or something? We don't know. But here's the public health solution that, at least in this situation, the cop thought was better than, God forbid, him not wearing a mask. Take a look at this.
Vous trouvez pas ça exagéré? C'est pas exagéré, votre affaire? Pour une histoire de masque? Pour un masque, là! Hein?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone in that restaurant would have been stressed out. I think some people would have been shocked. The man in question, for all we know, had a medical exemption. That was a bizarre health remedy to a possible health problem. And what's so crazy is there's been no mask law for the last 4 months when the pandemic has been raging. All of a sudden, it's such a crisis, that man has to be tackled and effectively beaten up.
Right, quite the opposite. We know now that the federal government, the federal public health officials were saying that masks are inappropriate, that we should not be wearing masks. We're not recommending masks. So now we've done a completely 180, and now we've got state patrols marching around and enforcing mandatory mask bylaws. And as you said, it is arming citizens with an opportunity to turn the government gun on their fellow citizens if they're not complying with the cause d'etre, which is wearing masks. And so this is what you see over and over again: is you see Karen types or folks that want to cancel a service or a company for whatever reason. They use this as a basis to do so, and they turn the government gun against these businesses that are already struggling under this current pandemic situation.
All right, let's whip through some of the cities. For folks who, we're going to skip over Toronto today, but for folks who are interested in Toronto's exemption, we had a very big discussion about that the other week. There's an excellent series of exemptions in the law for a number of purposes, including for creed. That's a deeply held set of beliefs. The most important thing about the Toronto law is that no one is allowed to ask you to prove your exemption. That is actually against the law. So let's jump right in. I have in my hand a list prepared by a variety of lawyers, and you're here to speak to this list. Let's start with Vancouver and Victoria. From at least at the date this was compiled, no laws out there yet.
Yeah, that's right. And these laws are being debated currently and are in the process of being enacted. So that's not unusual. And my understanding is that many of the bylaws around the country, including major cities in Alberta, for example, Edmonton and Calgary, are coming into effect tomorrow.
Yeah. So let's hop right into Edmonton first. Must wear a face covering in any indoor, enclosed, or substantially enclosed places. So this would include malls, churches, public vehicles, transit. But there are exceptions. What are the exceptions in Edmonton?
Yeah, so what the bylaw sets out is that folks that are unable to wear a face covering because of a mental or physical concern or limitation or something protected by the Alberta Human Rights Act. And so that seems to mirror the Toronto City bylaw quite closely. And also, obviously, folks that cannot wear or remove masks without assistance, children under 2. So similar exemptions. However, what I did not see in Edmonton or Calgary was the wording to the effect that that a person that claims an exemption is not required to prove the exemption.
Yeah, and as we talked about last time, this would be like someone in a wheelchair saying, I need to park in a wheelchair, park in a disabled parking place, and the shopkeeper saying, prove you're a paraplegic, prove it, prove you're a paraplegic before we let you park there. if shopkeepers demand that you prove you have a health exemption, that is quite possibly a violation of your rights and a violation of the bylaw, at least in certain cities, like Toronto, which explicitly says you can't do that. Some of these jurisdictions that have poorly worded laws are frankly setting themselves up for a lawsuit.
Yeah, I think so, and certainly a human rights complaint at the minimum, because the human rights codes across the country, they've been recognized as quasi-constitutional, which means that they are extremely important, and thus a city bylaw, even if it's worded in such a way where a human rights complaint could arise, the human rights code would likely overrule the bylaw.
Let's hop ahead to the prairies. Looks like so far there are no laws in the prairie provinces, but moving west to east, Ottawa, they have a rule. Face coverings in public spaces, malls, retail business. By the way, you can see all these stats we're looking at maskexemption.ca. So don't worry if you're not catching it in real time. Go to maskexemption.ca. Exemptions for kids under 2, but also for kids under 5 who are squirmy, which I think is sort of funny. I mean, some jurisdictions say kids under 5, some say kids under 2. Again, the distinction is not, there's no medical reason why kids in Ottawa who are 5 are exempt, but kids in Calgary who are 3 are covered. That's just, again, politics, and it shows that this is all jiggery pokery, changing rules, changing vibes. This is not science.
Yeah, it's impractical to have these inconsistencies, especially in close by towns. We've had situations during this pandemic, not related to the masks, but for example, when the stages reopen, where you have on one side of the street the business can open, on the other side of the street it can't, and that can remain in place for a long time. And the same goes with this. If I have my kids, and one happens to be a 5-year-old, if I cross the street, that child has to wear a mask. If I'm on the other side of the street, they don't. This inconsistency creates just lots of problems, and these are the types of problems that legislation needs to address. Instead, they're just created by these laws.
Very important part, and we put this in bold on the website for the Ottawa bylaw. No person shall be required to provide proof of any of the exemptions set out above. And this is so important. And the card that we printed for people to either buy from us laminated for $10 or they can just print off a copy for free from the website. It's written in a friendly way. Please help. Hey, I'm exempt. Let's be friends. We're not fighting. Because shopkeepers are stressed out by this. Shopkeepers don't like this. It's so important that shopkeepers know that they don't have to be detectives. They don't have to be judges. They don't have to be cops. They don't have to say, you prove it. In fact, it's illegal for them to say, you prove it. So this will come as a great relief, not just for members of the public, but if you're running a Starbucks, if you're running a Coffee Time or whatever, and someone comes in and says, I got an exemption, that is the best news that a shopkeeper can have, because he is actually forbidden from getting into a fight. Well, good. So he cannot say, prove it, prove it, prove it.
Yeah, you're right. It protects both sides of the equation. As you said, the folks that need the exemption, they need to claim the exemption, they're embarrassed or uncomfortable, and they shouldn't be required to prove their exemption on the spot in a stressful situation with lots of folks around. And as you said quite rightly, the shopkeeper then is removed from having to play enforcer of the bylaw, which is an unfortunate aspect of this law, which defers enforcement upon shopkeepers that are already stressed out.
Yeah, and by the way, the tests here are one of the exemptions in Ottawa, for example, is if you have a medical condition that you can't properly wear a mask. Well, do you have trouble breathing? That's a medical condition. You don't have to prove it. You don't have to prove to the shopkeeper. You don't have to show them your hospital privacy. Same in Hamilton. Hamilton's the next city we cover. Anyone with an underlying medical condition which inhibits their ability to wear a face cover, you're exempt. Anyone with a disability that makes it difficult to wear or communicate while wearing a face covering. Is it difficult for you to communicate while wearing a face covering? If so, you're exempt. And again, that key point, anyone who simply states that one of the exemptions of this bylaw applies to them. So you're exempt for these 5 reasons, and then a 6th reason to be exempt is that you say you're exempt.
Right.
That Hamilton bylaw is actually either written extremely poorly or brilliantly. I can't tell. Because to be exempt, you just have to say you're exempt, and then you're exempt.
Well, I think that's good, and I think, look, that is, as you said, it may be, smart like a fox in the sense that we don't know if it was poor drafting or clever drafting, but ultimately, in my view, this is exactly what the exchange should be. I am claiming an exemption. I don't need to prove to you what the exemption is. Okay, great, go along your day. And I think that this type of law would be so frustrating to the citizen enforcers.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. If you believe the law applies to you, it applies to you very much. But if you say the law doesn't apply to you, it doesn't apply to you at all. It's actually completely brilliant. I prefer to look at it as brilliant rather than stupid, because simply saying you're exempt means you're exempt. So almost no one could be bound by this law if they just say, I'm not bound by it. Okay, that's...
And you know what? It's clever in the sense that, I feel like that's really the way it should go. But again, that's voluntary compliance.
Yeah. Let me move on to Simcoe County and the District of Muskoka, which includes Barrie. Some folks know that Muskoka includes sort of cottage country in Ontario, so it's not surprising to see that outdoor day camps and indoor day camps are exempted. Yeah. Schools are exempted, childcare is exempted. There's actually a fair amount of exemptions. Sounds like they're slightly more normal than some of the more crazy jurisdictions. And again, I come down to that very key part. People who are exempt need not give details about why they are exempt. And for any shopkeepers that are watching, I beg you, do not break the law. Do not make yourself a violator of someone's human rights. Even if you're a skeptic, that's not your job. Your job is to run a coffee shop. Your job is to run a barber shop. It's not your job to be a judge, jury executioner, cop, bylaw officer. Someone says they're exempt, you don't have the tools, the skills, the resources to be the judge of that. And luckily, the bylaw says people who are exempt need not give details about why they're exempt. Yeah. So that's good news for Barrie and Muskoka.
And that goes to the larger point, which is that, mandating masks, it's shrouded in problems. That's what we're dealing with here. But ultimately, if it was simply a voluntary compliance issue, and someone could simply say, I don't need to wear a mask, I don't want to wear a mask, then that is totally fine. And all the scolders would be perfectly fine wearing their own mask, but they wouldn't be able to turn the government gun on those that do not agree with the idea of wearing a mask.
Yeah. Next is the regional municipality of Niagara. Mask bylaw there too. One of the exemptions is if it would inhibit your ability to breathe. That is so vague. If you've worn a mask, you know that it inhibits your ability to breathe. That's why it's a mask.
Yeah.
So I don't see a special prohibition on asking for proof. Yeah. But again, if you start asking people to prove they have some sort of a disability, get ready for a human rights complaint. That's why these are terrible laws. Yeah. Because they're making people be snoops, snitches, informants, interrogators, inquisitors of each other. This is what I mean by the true pandemic. Pandemic's over. Trudeau predicted between 50,000 and 350,000 deaths in Canada. That's what his model said. Thank God we've had less than 9,000. This is the pandemic. It's a public health pandemic. Let's move on to Quebec. The whole province is covered in this one. This is one of the 2 provinces that has a province-wide coverage. What do you think of this province?
Well, again, we don't see is the same provision that we've seen across Canada, which is this exemption that you don't need to, the provision that you do not require proof of the exemption. But I don't see any reference to any sort of human rights, distinctions or protections. What I do see is people removing masks momentarily for identification purposes, and in classrooms, in a restaurant, and other enclosed spaces. But I don't, there don't seem to be a great deal of medical exceptions here. The only one would be if you're actually receiving treatment or engaging in a physical activity, so for example, exercising. So I don't see the types of wide protections and exemptions that are provided across the country. I view that as highly problematic, but it's Quebec and things are done completely different in Quebec.
The two things I would note in Quebec is that the mask bylaw does not apply to anyone under 12. Right. So that's a whole whack of exemptions. And for indoor spaces, if you're seated in an indoor space and are social distancing, you don't need a mask, which I think is common sense. Like, which is it? Do I need a mask and social distancing? Then why do I need social distancing? Or why do I need a mask? So there's a flicker of common sense in Quebec that if you're in a place, they list, for example, classrooms, cultural activities, entertainment, restaurant, food court, bar, and you're apart from it, you don't have to have your mask on if you and your little crew are 6 feet away from other people. This is all BS, but at least they recognize it's BS that you don't have to do both social distance and mask. Now I hear Dr. Fauci's talking about mandatory goggles. What a kook. Let's keep going. We have only a few more to go. St. John's, Newfoundland, none as of a few days ago. Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, New Brunswick, there's a public transit requirement, which, as far as these bans goes, is fairly limited.
Yeah.
There's a medical exemption, and you're not probably on a bus for 4 or 5 hours. You're probably on a bus for minutes.
Yeah.
It's not the worst of,
well,
of the
it's transitory, no pun intended, but it's also that, this seems to be the gateway. The transit mask bylaws seem to be the gateway into the wider city. So I would keep my eye on those spots.
Yeah. Nova Scotia, I'm going from memory, Nova Scotia has not had a new case in weeks. Or maybe I'm confusing that with New Brunswick. But maybe there's like a single case in all of Nova Scotia. A country province twice the size as Belgium. So it's ridiculous that they have a mask bylaw at all. But there are some exemptions again. Human rights conditions. If you have a human rights condition, and like in Ontario, creed, which is a way of saying a deeply held belief. If it's against your creed to wear a mask, you're exempt. So again, I would say to my friends in Nova Scotia, if someone comes to your shop and says, I'm exempt, do not pry and poke them at it, because if they're exempt under the Human Rights Code, you're not a judge to say otherwise. Let it go. Last one, why don't you cover the PEI? There's no rules there. How about airports? This is interesting to me. Go ahead.
That is very interesting. And so what you see here is there are some exemptions. You have to wear a face mask in an airport. You can't board a plane without a mask. You have to wear a face mask at the checkpoints, during boarding, during disembarking, and especially when you can't maintain the 6 feet distance.
Let me be extra clear. You have to have a mask, but you can sit in an airport without the mask on if you're 6 feet away from someone else. So when you're boarding the plane, when you're going through security, you need the mask on. But if you're just sitting in the airport and no one's within 6 feet of you, you don't need a mask. The CBC lied when they said Andrew Scheer was breaking that rule. Someone snapped a picture of Andrew Scheer talking to Brian Pallister in the airport. Neither had masks, and they tried to mask shame them. Of course, they're Trudeau's state broadcaster. But actually, as long as you have a mask on you in your pocket or whatever, you can be sitting by yourself 6 feet away from people and you're fine. It's when you go through security, when you get on the plane, or if you're instructed by a flight attendant, even on the plane. If you're 6 feet away from anyone else, you can be mask free on the plane. And again, I hate the fact that flight attendants, who already have a stressful enough job, are the enforcers of this. Now, flight attendants can order you to do this or that, and you have to comply. As with anything on an airplane, you have to comply with what they say. But you actually, under the law, don't have to wear a mask if you're 6 feet away from the next guy on the plane.
Right, and again, you know, further to your point, the policy is very specific. It expressly states a person must comply with any instructions given by the airport personnel or airplane personnel with respect to wearing a face mask. So that's pretty black and white.
Yeah. Look, we've covered the whole country, literally coast to coast, in the last 15 minutes here. And I want to try and sum this up for viewers who are probably their heads spinning with all the exemptions. First thing I would say is print off your exemption card, print off the generic one. If you're not in Toronto, if you're in Toronto, print off that specific one. Toronto's the biggest city, we'll probably have the most mask exemptions there. We have 2 other videos on this page that Aaron and I give advice to shopkeepers, advice to the members of the public. Check those out. But if I had to sum things up, it would be this. Don't pick a fight. Remember, the people who you're talking to are generally stressed out too, and let's not pit each other against each other. But be firm enough to say, look, the law has an exemption. I'm using the exemption. That's following the law. The exemption is part of the law. It's not a trick. It's not an anti-law. The exemption is an essential part of the law. It's what keeps the law legal. And the person you're giving the exemption to does not have the skills or resources or training to be a judge of that exemption. And so province after province, town after town says you don't have to prove it. You just have to say it, and that's enough. It's odious that the politicians of this country are turning us into snitches and informants. But many of these laws covering most Canadian citizens have exemptions that you simply say, I am exempt, and the matter's done. That's why the card is helpful, because just print off the card. It's free. If you want a laminated one, we'll send you one for $10, which is frankly our cost. And the card is just a friendly way of saying, hey, let's not fight. Look at this card. Go to maskexemption.ca. Watch the videos. Read the bylaws. Let's not fight. Just don't fight with me, because if I'm exempt, whether it's for a health reason or I can't breathe or my child isn't 12 in Quebec or whatever, just don't play cop. I hate the politicians because they've turned us into cops.
Yeah, it's so helpful, I think, to have a physical representation or reflection or expression of an exemption. And as you pointed out with the Hamilton bylaw, all you need to do is say that you have an exemption, and that's good enough under that bylaw.
Yeah, that's the craziest of the bylaws. You don't even have to have an exemption in Hamilton. You just have to say you're exempt. And Hamilton says, that's enough for us.
Yeah, and Rebel is stepping into the void here, because some municipalities and some transit systems have created their own mask exemption cards. But of course, some of the municipalities, when they faced a little bit of heat, they scrapped it.
Yeah, here's a look at the Toronto Transit Corporation, the largest transit company in Canada, as far as I know. They had their own mask exemption, and then obviously under pressure, they took it down. I don't know why. There are exemptions. Why wouldn't they have an exemption?
It's helpful, and it proves this important point, which is that, again, you should be able to have some sort of representation of this. So that's why I think this is an important cause.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks for going through this. There's so much in there, and it's probably going to change, and it's probably going to evolve. That's why the generic card that we're now letting you print for free, or you can buy for $10, just says go to maskexemption.ca. I think we're going to update this chart every week, probably, because there's probably going to be a change somewhere in Canada every week. It's not perfect, and don't take this as formal legal advice, but you're not going to a real court anyways. You're going into a Starbucks. That's not a court, and that's half the point here. Don't play lawyer, and don't let them play judge. Say you're exempt if you're exempt, and that ought to be the end of it. And there's so many exemptions here, and in Hamilton, simply saying you're exempt makes it true. So stay in touch on this, and don't let them get you. Don't let them get into your head, because that actually will be one of the worst legacies of the pandemic, is turning us afraid turning us against each other and creating a level of stress that will likely have higher health consequences than the pandemic itself. Last word to you, Aaron.
Well, you know what? I think it is important for people to study these laws, to have a better understanding of what their locality is saying about masks, to comply with those laws, and also to understand that there are these exemptions and you can use them if they're available to you.
Well, and that's the thing. I want to close on that in case it wasn't clear. I'm saying to you, comply with the laws. That's why we got a lawyer here. A lawyer doesn't give advice saying break the law. We're saying comply with the law, but the law has so many exemptions that you can follow and be in compliance. In Hamilton, you're complying with the law by saying you're exempt from the law. That's not breaking the law. That's following the law and complying with it. So our advice, if you're curious about it, if you don't understand me, I'm saying follow the law. I'm saying know what the law is, because there's a good chance you're exempt from it. All right, great to see you. Thanks for being here. Maskexemption.ca. Get your free card. You can print out yourself or order a laminated one from us, and we'll probably do an update in a week or so. Thanks. About a dozen different jurisdictions in Canada now have mask bylaws. Go to maskexemption.ca to see the exemptions in your jurisdiction and to download a free mask exemption card. That's maskexemption.ca.